Welcome to Recovery Inspired Hope. I am here with actually a returning person who has been on my videos before, and his story is just so amazing. He is currently helping people turn their life around in the crazy world of addiction, in this crazy world that we live in right now. Mr. Shane Sims, who wears so many hats, so many hats. So Shane, you tell everybody a little bit about what you do in the amazing community of Athens.
Yes, ma'am. Today I am a certified addiction recovery empowerment specialist. The acronym is CARES, and that is an individual with evidence based training that use their lived experience to help others to achieve the goal of long term recovery. Um, with that, I am executive director of People Living in Recovery. We're a 501c3 nonprofit located here in Athens, Georgia, that assists individuals with substance use, mental health, and homelessness challenges. I'm also co-director of Modern Pathways to Recovery, which is a 12-month inpatient treatment facility for men. I'm also chaplain of the Athens Clark County Police Department, and as of lately, I've been contracted with the Clark County Jail to um, present a mentor program that I designed while I was incarcerated to individuals with kind of high profile cases that aren't able to leave the cell blocks to go and to avail themselves of different programs. Um, Beside that, I consider myself a community advocate, not activist. Important distinction between that. I try to be a voice for the voiceless, and I try to bridge gaps, and I would like to think that I hopefully do a pretty good job of that.
Right. And your new hat is
Mhm.
you are a new dad.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I hit the reset button. My oldest daughter is 31. My newest addition, my son, is 14-month old. Yes,
14
ma'am.
months old. Wow. Those are the blessings of recovery.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So, Shane, to be qualified for all of these hats that you
Sure.
wear, you really had to have some serious lived experience to
Yes,
be
ma'am.
able to help others fight in this war.
Yes, ma'am.
Will you tell us a little bit about your lived experience?
Yes, ma'am. Well, I am the child of parents that suffered from addiction to crack cocaine and alcohol, and kind of a product of that situation. And when I say product of that situation, not necessarily their life choices, but a product of everything that goes with addiction and alcoholism. For me, I had a very traumatic experience with this in discovering that my parents um, were addicts one evening at the age of about 12 years old. Um, and it was a very traumatic experience that really shook my faith and my confidence in anything established. Of course, I couldn't articulate it that way then, but in just hindsight, that was when my life kind of began to spiral in another direction. And I'm careful not to say spiraled out of control, because ultimately, everything that happens in our life, there's a control over it. But I went on a journey of rebellion, a journey of loneliness, a journey of isolation that ultimately led to my own addiction to marijuana and alcohol. Really changed the trajectory of my life. Prior to this, I was a good student, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, sports, in social groups. But after that, I became something of an introvert. By the age of 13, my daughter was on her way, and she was born at the age of 14. By the age of 15, I was using marijuana and alcohol on a daily basis. By the age of 16, I guess you can say my social circle had completely changed. And now I can articulate it as being I gravitated towards those who were hurting like me, of my peers, whose parents were also addicts, who had long before indulged in the world of alcoholism and addiction. And that soon led to some pretty tragic circumstances. At the age of 18, during my senior year of high school, um, I made the fatal decision to go along with an armed robbery that resulted in a store clerk being murdered, and myself and four other teens been sentenced to life plus 15 years incarceration. My charge was accessory to felony murder and armed robbery, and
Wow.
that began a journey.
So this is like it's so crazy because we talk about trauma being the gateway to addiction, and it's like here you were, 11 years old as a Cub Scout, love your mom and dad, great kid,
Yes,
doing
ma'am.
good in school, and then all of a sudden, something happens and everything just your whole world gets shaken
Yes, ma'am.
and everything changed. Um so some pretty profound things happened when you were serving your sentence.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
You
ma'am.
want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would say that that's the substance of my life. I remember entering Telfast State Prison, which was my first permanent assignment, in Helen, Georgia, and 18 years old, 145 pounds soaking wet, and understanding I was going to one of the worst prisons in Georgia. And I remember thinking to myself that if I never walk back out of these gates, I'm going to make sure I have a quality of life. And I attributed that to my upbringing. Prior to my parents' addiction, we've been raised in the church, very close knit family, and to their credit, my parents, they were human. They overcame their addiction, and today my dad and I are best friends. My mom unfortunately passed in 2001 while I was incarcerated. Um, but I remember going into Telfair thinking that, I'm going to not just survive, but I'm going to thrive in this environment. I had no idea how, I had no idea why I even gained that level of conviction,
Right.
but it was a saving grace for me. And what I quickly learned is that most of the men that are in that environment don't know their fathers. Many, although the mother may have been present, didn't really know their mother. Me coming out of a two-parent household and having experienced what it was like to have engaged parents prior to, I realized I had something that a lot of the guys around me didn't. And I became kind of this go-to person. And I quickly realized also that many of the men that were at Telfair State Prison, older men, had served maybe 20, 30 years and better. And I think for me, coming in so young, one of the youngest one at prison, I guess I represented a kind of a breath of fresh air for them, kind of a connection to the outside world. However, I was also gifted with the ability to listen and internalize what a person is saying, and when I'm able to kind of give them or share my perspective with them. So that went on for about the first couple of years of being at Telfair, and ultimately, I think I became more intentional. I did become more intentional about it after a conversation with an officer. Her name was Miss Sims too.
Really?
Officer Sims, yes, yes. And I was coming back from the dining hall one evening, and there was one evening where there were many people on the sidewalk, and she said, "Sims, come here for a minute." And yes, ma'am. She said, "So you know what?" She said, "I got a nickname for you." I said, "What is it?" and
That's
she
scary.
said, she said, "I'm gonna call you Counselor Sims." She said, "Every time I see you," she said, "either you're talking to someone or you're listening to someone." And she said, "You'll be surprised at the impact it's making on the men that are around you." And it was at that moment that I became more intentional. And what I realized from there is that I had been doing as much for myself as I had for them, because being able to engage them and to hear their life stories, which was 20 times worse than mine, I was able to deal with my situation by helping them and helping others through their situations. And I think it was at that point that I said, you know what, this may be my purpose, my reason. And that's the way I did about the next 17 years of my life
Wow, in
in
prison. So
prison.
you were basically doing peer support in prison
Yes, ma'am.
before peer support was even a
I
thing.
think, right.
You basically like founded it. That's
Well,
it's invented.
yes,
So okay, tell me a little bit about what does it look like being in one of the worst prisons in the state of Georgia? I mean,
ma'am.
that especially at 18 years old like is terrifying, but tell us what does that look like?
Well, yeah. The good and bad of it is that the human being has this kind of uncanny ability to adapt to any circumstance. You become what you need to survive. For many of the men, that unfortunately became institutionalized, kind of unfeeling, And it wasn't that they are monsters, but they had to become this unfeeling thing in order to not be overwhelmed by so much. For
Mm-hmm.
me, I was fortunate. I had a foundation, and what again became kind of a directional situation for me was one evening, um, one of the counselors called me down to the office, and at that time, counselors were in the dorms. That no longer happens. But he had been watching me. He was an older black man, and when I came in, he told me, he said, "Close my door." And I sat down, and he said, "Listen," he said, "I know you have a life sentence." He said, "I know these guys around here telling you that no matter what you do, you're not going to get out of this life sentence." He said, "But for whatever reason, God is putting it on my heart to tell you that you just continue to do the next right thing. You do what you have to do, and you're going to be all right." And he said it with such conviction that
Mm-hmm.
he made me believe it. And I would later find out that he was also a pastor. Um,
Wow.
so for me, I kind of processed all these experiences through the lens of faith. When I met certain challenges that were overwhelming for the average person, I got back centered in myself. I'm by this time I had chosen Islam or being Muslim as my way of life, and praying 5 times a day gave me something to return to
Mm-hmm.
5 times throughout that day. And I think that I wasn't overwhelmed as much as the men around me by the oppressive circumstance conditions because they were there, and I'm me coming out and doing this well is an exception. It's not the rule, but I think I was able to navigate that because I constantly had a core to return to,
Right.
that space to return to, and so
Mm-hmm.
it was rough. It was rough, but I think I took the worst of the experiences and kind of brought out the best in myself by holding firm to my faith and just living by principle and just not being driven by passion, fears, or angers as much as possible.
Right. And I think it's just amazing that God will meet you wherever you're at and he will
Yes,
send
ma'am.
people to you to tell you, things to reassure you that he's got you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
And that's pretty miraculous. So you did end up getting out,
Mhm.
and that story was a little crazy as well,
Yeah,
right?
it was. It was. After being at Telfair, I guess about 3 years, I was approached by the deputy warden, which is like the second in control. And he too had, I guess you can say profile. It's their job to know who inmates are, who
Right,
they're dealing with.
right, yeah.
And he approached me one evening. He said, Sims, he said that I have an opening in laundry and warehouse, and I need someone to fill that opening. And the thing about it, laundry and warehouse, that's considered to be a prestigious job because you're trusted with access to so much and you deal with administration so closely. Um, and I can imagine in his mind, it was just like, if I offer him this, he's going to take it. However, by this time, I was teaching GED and I had, again, found my passion in helping men get their GED. And so when he offered me this, first thing came to mind, this could be lucrative because if you work in a warehouse, you can get new clothes and sell it to the inmate
Yeah.
population. And really, administration knew that, and that was just kind of one of the benefits of the job. But just quickly, it was just like no, because for me that would be so empty. Get clothes, sell them for what cakes and cookies, and but then lose that sense of purpose. And I told him, I said, well, I'm working at GD, and I said, and if you don't mind, I prefer to stay there. And I can just remember the look on his face, and he just started smiling. He said, "Okay." He said, "If you
Wow.
change your mind," he said, "just let me know." And I'm grateful that I did because it was while I was working in GD department that other administrators began to notice me. And in prison, word of mouth travels just like on the streets, especially amongst administration. So I was transferred to another prison in Hartwood, Georgia, and that reputation of trustworthiness followed me there. And it was there that I first became administration orderly. And this is where you actually work in the building that house the wardens, the secretaries, and so forth and so on. Now, here, it was different because you didn't have officers there per se. It was all civilian workers. And so it allowed me the opportunity to get out of the humdrum of prison life. I would go to
Mm-hmm.
detail in the morning and stay there pretty much all day. So I was able to become back socialized. That was important, but the biggest benefit of that is that ultimately the warden there, um, petitioned the parole board on my behalf for my release. Um, while I gained a lot of hope from that, it didn't materialize. But some years later, probably about 10 years later, a second warden petitioned the parole board, and shortly after that, at about my 18th year, um, this one particular warden that had a lot of political connection within the system. He had been in the system 32 years, I think, and had worked his way into a position of influence. I'll find this out later, but one day after a pretty catastrophic situation on the dorm I was on, he was like, Sims, he said, I've been talking to the parole board about you. And he said, I'm going to say every good thing about you under the sun, and I'm going to get you out of this prison. He said, but if you get out and mess up, I'm going to kick your expletive myself. And sure enough, I had a parole interview that day from a field officer, and probably about 6 months after, I was transitioned out to a work release program.
Wow. So there was a situation where the warden contacted the parole board.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and
Yes, ma'am.
tell me about that.
This situation was there was a young man that I had started mentoring. By this time, I'm a bit older, so he was younger than I. He was a blood gang member, and he really wanted to get out of the gang. But as you know, with the gangs, when they say blood in, blood out, they take that quite literally.
Right.
So there really wasn't much of an out for him. So I would be with him, kind of take him under my wing, so to speak, and kind of be that balancing force to all the other stuff that was going on in his life. And he was from Savannah. So we found out, we meaning he found out and he shared it with me shortly after we began to kind of spend time together on a daily basis, that he was going to be released. And not only that, but he was going back to Savannah, and he was going to be the first participant in a brand new pilot program they had for guys getting out of prison, where they would get them jobs, they were getting them apartments, and really getting them established. So he was excited about it, and getting home to his son. And unfortunately, another blood gang member moved into our dorm. This blood gang member was also a ranking gang member, but from another set. He and my young mentee, or I call him my young partner, they naturally gravitated towards one another, more out of obligation than anything, but ultimately became what seemed to be good friends. They ate together, they hung together. One evening, he and the other ranking gang member went to the commissary, to the store. So as I was told later, when the other gang member got his commissary from the store, he and my young mentee started walking back down the sidewalk, and another blood approached the other guy from my mentee's gang set and proceeded to rob him of his commissary. And that created a dilemma for my young mentee, because the guy that robbed his friend from another set was of his set, so he couldn't go against him and defend his friend, and so he had to kind of just stand down, so to speak. So I was told that when they got back to the dorm, the other blood gang member, my mentee, was in an argument, and he was like, "Why didn't you help me? We're supposed to be cool." And ultimately, they went into the room for a one-on-one fight, and said the other guy knocked my mentee out and pulled him out of the room onto kind of the cement catwalk, and said he proceeded to jump up and just smash his head with his cocaine.
Oh my goodness.
And they said that by the time he got out of the dorm, probably 50 yards down the sidewalk, his head was so swollen, my mentee's head was so swollen you couldn't even recognize him. And unfortunately, he died. And the other blood gang member that committed the murder, he had gone into such a hysteria that the next day, while in isolation, one of the officers said he woke up and said, "Well, how's he doing?" And said he looked at him and said, "How's he doing? You killed him." And said that he just had a breakdown in his cell. For myself, our dormitory went on lockdown, and because our dormitory was on lockdown, I wasn't able to go to administration, so it was a pretty big deal. I stayed on lockdown for about a month with the dorm before the warden finally sent down and said, "Hey, send Shane back up to administration, send Sims up to administration." And I remember walking into administration, and I had become very close with the warden secretary. She reminds you, the Southern Belle off Andy Griffith, but we had developed this camaraderie. And when I walked her in the corner to her office, I mean, she almost leaped out of her chair, and she said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm okay." And that's when I found out about the warden had petitioned the parole board. She said, "Listen," she said, "the warden has been speaking to the parole board on your behalf." She said, "I think they're supposed to come out today to interview you." She said, "But just go ahead and do what you normally do. Act like you don't know." And sure enough, after about an hour, I guess it was, that's when I was called into the office, and he let me know, and I went through the interview. Um, the beautiful thing about this is that after my meeting with the warden and the parole board field officer, we kind of plotted on how to pursue my release or the request for my release. So I came back to detail I guess about a few days later, and the warden secretary had two stacks of paper on the desk. And so when I walked in her office, I kind of joked about, how busy she looked. And she said, "Yeah, I am." She said, "And these stacks of papers," she said, "all these are guys that have made parole, but because they're sex offenders, they can't be released to their home." She said, "I have to figure out how to deal with this." And she said, on top of that, she said, "I have to write your parole recommendation from the warden." So me, being the thoughtful individual I was, like a light bulb went off. I said, "Well, I tell you what." She said, "What?" I said, "How about you tend to these stacks, and how about I write the recommendation and I bring it back for you?" She said, she looked for a minute. She said, "How about you do that?" She said, "If you tell somebody, I'm gonna kill you." And so I had a little closet. There was a little utility closet that I called my office, and I remember I had a notebook pad in there and had a pen, and I sat down and for the next about 30 minutes proceeded to write my own recommendation to the parole board from the warden. And for a second, I thought, well, maybe I'm overdoing it. And it wasn't that I was lying, but of course, if you write your own recommendation, you're advocating for your release. You're going to put down
Right.
all of the things that you're doing.
Right.
And but that's that moment of doubt was overcome by, what, you have worked to get yourself to this moment, and it wasn't work to get out of prison, because as far as I'm concerned, I probably was never getting out. It was work to have a quality of life and to help improve the quality of life of men that I was around. So it's just like, you've done this work, you've done it for the right reason.
Right.
Use this. And so I left it as it was, and I took it back to her, and she said, "Well, okay, I'll read it. You just come back around after a while." When I came back, she said, "This is perfect." She said, "I'll send it in for the warden to sign," and she said it should be sent off by this evening. And so it was. His recommendation was accepted, and I just, until today, I just thank God that I was in position to write my own recommendation to the parole board for my release. And that's part of what keeps me grateful. Keeps me grateful, and that's a lot of my message. I'm also a motivational speaker. That's the core of a lot of my message, is that you have to have hope, because hope gives you the motivation in the moment to utilize these opportunities that God puts in your life. And trauma really, it closes your eyes to these things. And so I was transferred out some months later to a work transitional center. Supposedly, if you have a life sentence, you're to stay at a work transitional center for at least 24 to 36 months. I stayed there 9 months, I think, before I got news of my release. And on February 3rd, 2016, I returned home after serving 20 years incarceration.
Wow. 20 years. Can we go back? Could you talk a little bit about, you were talking about like the gang activity. Now, I've been hearing about a lot of this, and there's a lot of prison channels on YouTube, and is it true that the gangs today are running the jails?
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it's absolutely true. I think it was true for the West Coast and for on the East Coast before Georgia, but now, it's true here in Georgia, and it's largely due to the combination of lack of employees. There's not enough officers to run it, but also the influx of drugs in the prison system, the harder drugs. When during my time there was a lot of marijuana and homemade alcohol, But now you're having what's called strips, and now you have the opiates and the methamphetamines are there. And so you can imagine if you reduce the number of staff, but you increase the presence of opiates, methamphetamines, the result is that it is survival of the fittest. And just unfortunately, when it comes to kind of the laws of the jungle, the biggest animals survive, and gangs are just the biggest creatures that are there now. So I still talk to several guys that are still locked up. One in particular, he's been locked up over 30 years. And to just hear the exasperation, the desperation in his voice, and he's I mean, just a strong individual. But he's gotten to the point where he's just like, man, if I don't get out of here, I don't even know if I'm gonna survive. He's like, man, these young guys are stupid, and so it has become a survival mechanism for a lot of these guys. It's like now he said when you walk through the gates, you have to make a choice. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of it's a necessity.
Right.
It's a necessity. You have to affiliate yourself with something in order to survive, and so unfortunately, the gangs are the dominant force there.
Right. And yeah, because I saw an article where they were like are influencing the outside as well by like making phone calls and having people on the outside do things because from them like not sending money or things like that.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of a few instances of extortion, and it would take a separate podcast to even address the dynamics there,
Right.
because I would not just lump them all into a category. These are terrible people. What these are people that are under, I mean, just the greatest duress you can imagine, trying to survive. Many of whom come from communities where funds have been divested from the educational system. There are no social infrastructures. Therefore, they have no coping tools, no coping mechanisms. And so you put someone like that in a situation like this where they have to figure out how to survive, then just they're going to default to whatever they're used to or whatever at least appears to be a good option of survival. So I wouldn't delve too much into speaking on this situation because there's so much more to be unpacked when it comes to gangs. And I will say that it's not just a proliferation of just inconsiderate, callous individual. These are the results of individuals trying to survive under extraordinary circumstances.
Right.